Module 4, Creating a Research Study. In the first few modules, we discussed what research is, how to create inclusive research to overcome the biases of autism research, and how to develop a research question. In this module, we'll discuss the steps to creating a research study. After developing the research question, there are two important steps researchers must take to create the research study. First, researchers have to choose a type of data to collect in order to answer their question. And second, they have to choose a study design that they will use to deliver the therapy and collect the data. We will go over these steps and terms throughout the module. Section 1. Choose the type of data to collect. In this section, we'll describe what qualitative and quantitative data are and how mixing these approaches can be helpful. We will also discuss how choosing a philosophical framework for a research study can help researchers decide what types of data to collect. Data is the information that researchers collect and analyze to answer a research question. Researchers collect data about the outcome from their research question. An outcome measure is the tool researchers use to collect data about the outcome of a research question, like a survey or assessment. There are two types of data researchers may want to collect in their research study, qualitative and quantitative. Researchers can also decide to use a combination of the two, which is called a mixed methods approach. The lines between qualitative and quantitative data sometimes get blurred, especially if you're designing a survey. We will describe qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods as they are ideally used in the next few slides, but you can find more information about these types of data in our additional resources. The first type of data is qualitative data, which is typically used to describe subjective information about people's experiences and perspectives. In autism therapy research, this type of data is often used to learn about people's experiences with different therapies, like answering questions about what caregivers liked or disliked about a therapy for their child and why. The research team will look for patterns in the qualitative data to describe people's experiences and perspectives. There are many outcome measures that can be used for qualitative data. This includes interviews, focus groups, and observations of behaviors. We'll discuss more about ways to analyze qualitative data in the next module, but there's also more information about this in the additional resources. Community involvement is very important for designing qualitative data outcome measures. For qualitative measures, community members can help create the questions that will be asked in interviews or focus groups. This ensures that researchers collect information that is important to the community. They can also check that qualitative measures are asked in a clear and accessible way. This may be especially important for autistic participants who may have different communication preferences than non-autistic participants. Community members can also be part of the team that looks for patterns in the qualitative data. We'll talk more about that when we discuss data analysis in the next module. A big strength of qualitative methods is that it provides a deep understanding of people's individual experiences and perspectives. The open-ended nature of qualitative data might encourage people to share ideas outside of what researchers would even know to ask about. This can help researchers better understand the wide range of positive and negative perspectives about a topic. It can even help researchers create new hypotheses or topics for future research questions. It can also help answer questions about why a therapy did or did not work based on people's unique experiences. But the biggest limit is that these methods are subjective, so the results are limited to the perspective of the participants. It can also not be used to say whether or not a therapy led to significant measurable change, because each person has a unique perspective about what significant change may look like for themselves or for their child. Researchers may be able to tell if people generally thought it was helpful, but can't measure the size of the change. Qualitative research can also take a long time to analyze. The second type of data is quantitative data, which is best used to collect objective information gained from measuring and counting things. In autism research, quantitative data is usually used to measure participants' responses to the therapies, like looking to see if children show improvement on language scores after a new speech-language therapy. To collect quantitative data, researchers use tools like standardized assessments, surveys that use a rating scale, or behavioral observations where the researchers count the frequency of specific behaviors. Community involvement is also very important for choosing quantitative measures. Community members can make sure that the behaviors or skills being counted are relevant and important to the community. It also ensures that researchers are accurately measuring the behaviors or skills they think they're measuring. The major strength of quantitative methods is that it allows you to fairly measure change after a therapy. Quantitative data reduces bias between participants because data is counted the same way for everyone, rather than relying on personal experiences and perspectives. One limitation of quantitative data is that researchers are limited in understanding differences between unique participants because things are measured in the exact same way for everyone, and results are usually calculated for the whole group. These methods are also limited in answering questions about how or why a therapy does or does not work. Researchers can use some data analysis methods to understand why something works or who it might work best for, but researchers are limited to understanding variables that are easy to measure in a quantitative way. Lastly, researchers might use mixed methods, which means they combine qualitative and quantitative data. The qualitative and quantitative data are combined, or mixed, to help researchers understand the answer to their research question. For example, mixed methods can be used to understand the effectiveness of a therapy alongside personal satisfaction with the therapy. So you can see if a reason why a therapy worked is because people liked it. Researchers collect mixed methods data using a combination of qualitative and quantitative data, like using a behavioral observation to objectively count a child's skills after therapy, and then asking caregivers questions in an interview. A strength of mixed methods is that it allows researchers to look at measurable change while also understanding personal experiences. You get the benefits of both quantitative and qualitative methods. The biggest limitation is that it takes a ton of time, money, resources, and expertise to do this type of research. Let's use the example from the previous module to show how qualitative and quantitative data are different. As a reminder, the example was about a study researching a visual schedule therapy to reduce children's distress when transitioning between activities. The outcomes the researchers decided to measure included the caregiver's satisfaction with the visual schedules, caregivers' frequency of using the schedules, and the child's distress during transitions. We will go through each of these outcomes and decide if we should use qualitative or quantitative data. Qualitative data is used to understand individuals' personal experiences and perspectives. In this example, caregiver satisfaction with the visual schedule therapy program is an example of people's personal perspectives, so the researchers might want to use a qualitative data approach. Quantitative data can tell us about measurable change. It is data that we count or use numbers to measure. So we can use a quantitative approach to count how frequently caregivers used the visual schedule program. We may also use it to measure how much children's distress changed after the therapy program. We can also use mixed methods, where we use a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. For our example, we can use the qualitative data about caregiver satisfaction to understand our quantitative data about the frequency of using schedules in the child's distress. Here are examples of specific outcome measures researchers can use to collect data about these outcomes. To measure the caregiver's satisfaction, researchers can do an interview with them after the therapy program, where they ask questions about the caregiver's experience in the therapy. They are describing caregivers' personal experiences, so it is a qualitative measure. To measure the child's distress, researchers can ask parents to keep a log where they rate their child's frustration on a 1 to 5 scale during each transition during the day. To measure the caregiver's use of the visual schedule, we ask them to report if they use the visual schedule during each transition in the log. Both of these outcome measures involve numbers and measuring, so they're both quantitative. It's easy to see how mixing qualitative and quantitative methods can help researchers understand their results better. Let's say that children showed no decrease in frustration after the therapy program. Also, caregivers only reported using visual schedules during half of the child's transitions. Looking only at the quantitative results, it seems like the therapy program was not helpful. But when we add in the caregiver interview, maybe we see that caregivers like the visual schedules and find them useful. However, they said that they need more help learning how to use them. Mixing qualitative and quantitative methods helped researchers understand why the therapy may not have worked to decrease child distress. The problem may not be the therapy itself, but the way researchers taught the caregivers to use the visual schedules. This helps researchers understand the next steps. Maybe, in the next study, more time could be spent teaching parents how to use visual schedules. Then, researchers could see if this program is helpful for the quantitative outcomes. Researchers should also consider their philosophical framework when choosing the type of data to collect. A philosophical framework refers to the beliefs and worldview influencing why the research is desired. For example, some people want to conduct a research study to better understand something they're curious about. Some people conduct research to improve quality of life and outcomes. Some people may conduct research for the purposes of social justice and transforming policy and culture. The philosophical framework someone uses can impact the kind of data they want to collect. For example, if someone wants to learn more about things they're curious about, they might want to use qualitative data and ask people about their curiosity. If a researcher is interested in improving outcomes, they may want to use quantitative data to measure how a certain therapy or service changes outcomes. We included additional resources about philosophical frameworks and how to use them in the additional resources for this module. If you would like to take a break, this is a great place to do so. Section 2. Choose the study design. In this section, we'll discuss different ways to design a study, including observational studies, experimental studies, and more. We'll also discuss a concept that's important to consider when designing a study: validity. A study design is a way of structuring a research study to answer a specific research question. There are many different study designs with unique strengths and limitations. Choosing the right study design helps researchers answer their questions in clear, trustworthy ways. We will now review some basic types of research studies, but you can learn more about different study designs in the additional resources. An observational study is when researchers collect data to learn about something currently happening in the world. They are not changing or testing anything, but observing how things currently work. For example, if researchers want to understand how clinicians currently support caregivers in early intervention sessions, they will collect information about what happens in the session without asking clinicians to do anything specific. Some strengths of observational studies are that they require few resources and help researchers understand what is currently happening in clinical practice. This can tell researchers what is or is not working and give them ideas about feasible and appropriate ways to make more helpful, effective therapies for autistic children and their families. But because researchers only observe people in observational studies, they can't control how therapy is delivered to each child or family. This can introduce bias because our results may actually be caused by something we are not controlling in the study. We'll review an example of this in the next couple of slides. For example, let's say a researcher is interested in whether occupational therapy is more effective in a clinic or in the home. They can use an observational study where they collect data about progress for the children on occupational therapists' caseloads. Then they can compare the progress made by children receiving therapy at home or in the clinic to see if children do better in one setting over the other. Let's say children who received therapy in the clinic made more progress than children who received therapy at home. Based on the observational study results, the researchers might think that clinic-based therapy is always better than home-based. But because we couldn't control what the occupational therapists were doing, it's possible that another variable accidentally influenced our results. For example, it could be that clinics have special equipment that families do not typically have access to at home, and maybe this equipment is important for children to learn some skills. It's possible that by giving families access to this equipment, it will help children make more progress at home. The researchers' results about which environment is more beneficial were biased by the difference in equipment. Even though this type of study design isn't perfect, it can help researchers understand how they should design therapies and what factors they should control in a different research study. In experimental studies, researchers test the influence of something on outcomes of interest. For example, they can use an experimental study to test the effect of AAC devices on children's communication skills. In experimental studies, researchers can control the environment to reduce bias. In our AAC example, researchers will control who gets access to AAC, how long they get access to it, and how they are taught to use it. This helps researchers make sure that their study reflects the influence of the AAC devices and not another outside source. One strength of experimental studies is that they allow researchers to test new therapies and supports for autistic children and families. They also make us more confident that our outcomes are because of the thing being tested and not an outside variable. But experimental studies take a lot more time, money, and resources than observational studies. Observational studies are very helpful for understanding what is currently helping autistic children and families. But researchers must use experimental studies to understand what new things will also help autistic children and families. So experimental studies are the most common type of study for early autism therapy research. In the next few slides, we'll describe some of the different kinds of experimental studies. The most common type of experimental study is the randomized controlled trial, or RCT. An RCT is a study where participants are randomly assigned to a group and outcomes are compared between the groups. Most RCTs will have two groups. One group will be the therapy group that gets the therapy researchers want to test in their study. This group gets the intervention from PCOTS in the research question. The other group can get a comparator therapy or be a control group that gets no experimental therapy. In medical studies, this might be called the placebo group. People in a control group are allowed to continue their usual therapy services, but they don't get anything new in the study. These control groups are important because they allow researchers to test a new therapy compared to what is already going on in usual clinical practice. Randomization is the process of randomly assigning participants to a group. Researchers will use a method like flipping a coin or generating random numbers to randomize participants. Randomization reduces bias because researchers can't decide which group the family will be in based on their own preferences. Let's take our example from the previous module about a visual schedule therapy to support toddlers' distress. Group 1 receives a visual schedule therapy program, and Group 2 is a control group that does not receive any additional therapy. The researchers use a random number generator where the family picks a number out of a hat. If they pick an odd number, they'll be assigned to Group 1, and if they pick an even number, they'll be in Group 2. So if a family chooses the number 3, they'll be assigned to Group 1, the visual schedule group. An important concept in randomized controlled trials is naivety or blinding. This is when information about group assignment is withheld from the research team and/or participants to make the study more fair. It reduces bias that researcher or participant beliefs might bring to the research study. Researchers will be naive or blind to group assignment for participants. If a researcher believes that the therapy group will do better than the control group, they might treat people differently based on their group assignment, even if they don't mean to. For example, if the research team uses a standardized test to measure child progress in a study, they may give a child credit for a question they got incorrect because they know the child was in the therapy group. So to prevent this, the person given the assessment will be naive to the child's group assignment. Families may be naive to how progress is measured, so that they don't answer questions in a way they think researchers would want to see. Randomized controlled trials can be designed in a few different ways depending on the researcher's question or logistics. There are 3 types of study design that we will briefly define in the next few slides, but please see the additional resources for more information. Between subjects design is when a participant is assigned to only one group and the researchers compare outcomes between the groups. Our previous example of the visual schedule study is a between subjects design. We'll go through what this looks like in the next slide. Here is an example of what the timeline would look like for our example. In month 1 of the study, people in both groups would get the measure of child distress. Then, in the next few months of the study, the visual schedule group will get the visual schedules therapy. The control group will not get any therapy. Then, in the last month of the study, both groups will get the measure of child distress again. Then, researchers might measure the change in child distress from the beginning to the end of the study for both groups. They can then see which group made more change. If the visual schedule group changed a lot more than the control group, this gives us confidence that visual schedules might be effective. There are different ways that they can calculate change and compare the groups, which you can find out more about in our additional resources. A within subjects design is when each participant is assigned to both groups and researchers compare outcomes for each person. For example, participants might be assigned to do therapies in different orders, and then researchers compare the outcomes. The order is switched to make sure that the change wasn't because of a timing-related variable, like the child's age or the order of the therapies. Researchers usually compare 2 therapies when they do a within subjects design, instead of using one therapy and a control group. Let's pretend that in our example study, researchers wanted to compare a visual schedule therapy with a timer therapy, where children are given a timer that counts down before a transition. All participants will get both the visual schedule therapy and the timer therapy, but they will be randomized to get the therapies in a different order, starting with either the visual schedules or the timer therapy. Participants will be randomized to start with the visual schedule therapy program and then do 3 months of the timer, or to start with the timer therapy and then do the visual schedule therapy. The child's distress will be measured before and after each therapy. Researchers will add up the change during the visual schedule therapy and the change for the timer therapy. Then they'll compare whether people changed more during the visual schedule therapy or the timer therapy. A longitudinal study is a study where you follow participants over a long period of time. You may use this design when you want to look at the long-term impact of a therapy. You can use a longitudinal study with any type of study design. This term just refers to the timing of the study. Let's go back to the example of a visual schedule therapy versus a control group. At age 2, children will receive the visual schedule therapy or no therapy. The researchers will measure child distress after the therapy program. Then, 4 years later, they will measure child distress again. They will measure change in child distress between ages 2 and 6 for each group. Then, they can compare the change between groups to see if the visual schedule therapy had a long-term effect on the child's distress. Validity is an important concept to think about when designing a good research study. Validity is a word that broadly means how truthful or similar a study is to something else. There are two primary types of validity: internal and external validity. We will describe these terms in the next 2 slides. Internal validity is the similarity of the therapy and study context for all study participants. Internal validity is important because it ensures that all participants get the same type of care and that results are due to the therapy and not outside factors. For example, a study with high internal validity may make sure that all participants get therapy in the same place with the same type of materials for the same number of sessions. External validity refers to how similar the therapy and study context are to real-world contexts. For example, if EI normally only approves 1 speech therapy session each week, but the therapy in a research study requires 5 sessions a week, the study may have low external validity. The study therapy is very different than therapy in the real world. External validity is important because the therapies being researched will need to be used in real life. It can be tricky to find a balance between internal and external validity. With internal validity, it's important to know that the therapy is the thing that supported the outcomes. But if we control the study too much to favor internal validity, then the therapy might look very different than how therapy works in the outside world. In other words, that control can lower external validity. And if there is low external validity, then the therapy might not translate to real-world settings or be very helpful. Community members provide important insight into the design process by helping researchers understand more about the real-world contexts where these therapies would be delivered. They can also help researchers understand where they can make changes to favor internal or external validity, depending on what the community is prioritizing and the specific research question being asked. Developing a research study is a very complex process. Please see the resources for information about additional concepts and for more details on the concepts described here. In the previous modules, we've talked about how to create inclusive research, how to develop a research question, and described different types of data and study designs. In the next module, we will talk about how to actually conduct the research study. This resource is part of a project funded through a Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute Eugene, Washington PCORI Engagement Award. The content is solely the responsibility of the authors and does not necessarily represent the official views of PCORI.